Ma'am, the diner was the kind of place that felt like a second home to anyone who entered. A small, unassuming building with a neon sign flickering over the door. Inside, the air smelled of coffee, sizzling bacon, and the faint sweetness of maple syrup. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and the counter with its row of bar stools was manned by a cheerful waitress pouring refills of coffee. The regulars, farmers, teachers, and retirees chatted over their breakfast, forming a quiet buzz that was comforting and familiar. In the farthest corner booth, near a window that overlooked the street, sat Jim. He was a tall, lanky man in his late 60s, his posture slightly stooped from age. His jacket, though old and faded, was clearly special. Military patches adorned its sleeves, and a name tag above the chest pocket bore his name. Jim had been coming to this diner for years, often eating alone, but always with a warm smile for the staff and a kind word for anyone who spoke to him. Today he was having his usual breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a small cup of black coffee. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked Andrew, a younger man in his 30s. Andrew had the air of someone who wanted to be noticed. Dressed in a tailored suit and carrying a sleek leather briefcase, he moved with confidence, glancing around the diner with a faintly judgmental expression. He clearly wasn't a regular. As he sat down at a table near Jim, the contrast between the two men couldn't have been starker. One embodying humility, the other exuding self-importance. The quiet hum of the diner was as steady as ever, a blend of clinking silverware, low conversations, and the occasional sizzle from the griddle. Andrew had just settled into his seat near the counter, flipping open his laptop while waiting for his coffee. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood out in the casual, homespun atmosphere of the small-town eatery. As the waitress set his mug of steaming coffee in front of him, Andrew took a glance around the room, his eyes landing on Jim in the corner booth. At first, his gaze was casual, but it lingered on the older man's appearance. Jim's jacket, worn and frayed at the edges, with patches dulled from decades of wear, seemed to hold a story that Andrew didn't care to understand. Instead, his lips curled into a faint smirk. Something about the sight struck him as odd, outdated even, and a thoughtless remark formed in his mind. Unable to resist, Andrew's voice cut through the calm of the diner, loud enough to catch everyone's attention. "Nice jacket," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. Didn't realize thrift stores had a military section. The room fell silent, as though someone had flipped a switch. The clinking silverware stopped. Conversations trailed off mid-sentence. Even the waitress froze mid-step, her hand gripping the coffee pot as she glanced nervously toward the corner booth. Jim looked up, startled by the unexpected comment. His tired blue eyes met Andrew's gaze for a brief moment before dropping back to his plate. He didn't respond, his expression calm but betraying a faint sadness. Instead, he reached for his fork and continued eating, as if willing the moment to pass without incident. But Andrew wasn't finished. Emboldened by Jim's silence and the lack of intervention from anyone else, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with an air of confidence. His voice carried even louder now, tinged with mockery and a sense of superiority. "Seriously, though," he continued, gesturing toward Jim with a slight wave of his hand, "why hang on to something so ragged? It's not like you're still in the service. Time to move on, right?" The words hung in the air like an unwelcome chill. The patrons, who had been trying to act as if they weren't listening, couldn't hide their discomfort. A couple seated in a nearby booth exchanged uneasy glances. A young woman with earbuds paused her music and turned to watch. Even the cook in the kitchen, visible through the past window, stopped flipping pancakes for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he listened. The waitress, still clutching the coffee pot, shifted her weight awkwardly. She glanced toward Jim, as if debating whether to step in, but she hesitated. Andrew's sharp, dismissive tone had thrown everyone off, leaving the once familiar diner atmosphere heavy with tension. Jim sat quietly, his hand resting on the edge of his plate. His fork was still, his appetite seemingly gone. He didn't look at Andrew again, but there was a subtle tightening in his jaw, a small tell that betrayed the sting of the words. To anyone watching closely, it was clear that the veteran had heard far too many comments like this before. The patches on his jacket, the ones Andrew had ridiculed, each told a story, though none of the diners knew their full significance yet. They were symbols of battles fought, friendships lost, and sacrifices made. To Jim, they were more than pieces of fabric. They were pieces of him, threads of his life stitched into the worn material he wore with pride. But Andrew couldn't see that. To him, the jacket was just an outdated, frayed relic. What's the point of holding on to something like that? Andrew muttered, more to himself now, though his voice was still loud enough for most to hear. Clinging to the past doesn't do anyone any favors. A woman seated at the counter cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. She looked as though she might speak up, but hesitated, her eyes darting to Andrew and then back to her coffee cup. A teenage boy in a nearby booth whispered to his father, but his father shook his head, as if to say, "Not now." The air felt heavy with unspoken tension. Some patrons seemed to want to intervene, but couldn't find the right words or the courage. Others appeared frozen, unsure of how to react to such a blatant display of disrespect. Jim finally set his fork down and reached for his coffee cup. His hands, weathered and calloused from years of labor and service, trembled slightly as he brought the cup to his lips. He sipped slowly, his expression unreadable. To everyone watching, he seemed to be deliberating on whether or not to respond. The room held its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. In the corner, unnoticed by most, a casually dressed man with a shock of tousled hair and a quiet presence observed the scene intently. Elon Musk had been sitting there for some time, eating his breakfast in peace. As Andrew continued his remarks, Elon leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes focused on the exchange, his expression unreadable. The stage was set for a moment no one in the diner would ever forget. Jim set his fork down with deliberate care, the faint clink of metal on porcelain, the only sound in the hushed diner. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear or anger, but from the weight of memories that seemed to settle over him like an invisible shroud. Whether it was age or emotion causing the tremor, it didn't matter. What mattered was the look in his eyes as he finally raised them to meet Andrew's gaze. His expression was a complicated mix of sadness, patience, and something deeper, an unshakable dignity that spoke volumes even before he opened his mouth. "This jacket," Jim began, his voice quiet but steady, "is more than just a piece of clothing to me." The words were simple, but they carried a gravity that immediately silenced even the faint whispers in the room. He paused, his gaze dropping to the worn fabric of his sleeve. His fingers brushed over the frayed edges of a patch, the touch almost reverent, as if he were handling something sacred. "Every one of these patches tells a story," he continued, his voice growing softer, as though he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. "This one here." He pointed to a tattered emblem stitched onto his upper arm, its colors faded but still discernible. "This is from my first unit. I was just a scared kid back then, barely out of high school. I didn't know what I was getting into, but these men, they became my family." Jim's gaze lingered on the patch for a moment, and then he moved his hand to another one, this time near his chest. His voice caught slightly as he continued. "And this one, this belonged to my buddy Mark. We swapped patches before our last mission, kind of a tradition we had. He didn't make it back." The room seemed to hold its collective breath, the clinking of dishes, the rustling of napkins. All of it ceased as the weight of Jim's words filled the air. Even Andrew, who had been smirking moments earlier, now sat frozen, his expression shifting to something that resembled unease. Jim took a sip of his coffee, the cup trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes, clouded with memory, gazed somewhere far beyond the walls of the diner. "This jacket isn't about the past," he said finally, setting the cup back down with a soft clink. "It's about the people I served with, people I remember every day, people who didn't get to come home and grow old like I did." He paused again, his voice taking on a tone of quiet resolve. "That's why I wear it. Not because I'm stuck in the past, but because I owe it to them to remember, to honor what they gave." The room remained silent, the kind of silence that was almost deafening in its intensity. The patrons, who had been mere onlookers moments before, now seemed captivated by Jim's words. A few shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as if trying to process the weight of what they had just heard. The waitress, who had been hovering uncertainly near the counter, blinked rapidly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She set the coffee pot down, no longer pretending to be occupied. A middle-aged man sitting at a nearby table, his trucker cap pushed back on his head, folded his arms and nodded solemnly, as though silently affirming every word Jim had said. Jim's gaze finally returned to Andrew. His expression wasn't accusatory or angry. It was calm, almost gentle, but there was an undeniable firmness in his eyes. "I get it," he said, his voice low but unwavering. "Maybe it's hard to understand if you haven't been through it. But this jacket, these patches, they're not just fabric. They're memories. They're promises. And as long as I'm still breathing, I'm not going to forget." Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. His smirk had vanished, replaced by an uncertain frown. For the first time, he didn't seem to know what to say. Jim exhaled quietly, leaning back in his booth. He reached for his coffee once more, his hands steady now, as if the act of sharing his story had brought him a measure of peace. Around him, the other diners remained silent, their faces a mixture of respect and reflection. The tension that had filled the room moments earlier had been replaced by something else, a deep, almost reverent understanding. Even those who had initially hesitated to speak up found themselves wishing they had said something sooner. But no one dared interrupt the moment. The air felt heavy with the unspoken realization that Jim's story wasn't just about a jacket, it was about the weight of sacrifice, the bonds of brotherhood, and the importance of remembering what so many had fought for. The silence stretched for a few moments longer, until it was broken by the soft clatter of a spoon as someone stirred their coffee. Slowly the hum of the diner began to return, but the mood had shifted irrevocably. Jim picked up his fork and resumed eating, his demeanor as calm and unassuming as ever. For him, the moment had passed, but for everyone else, it lingered, an indelible mark that would not soon fade. What no one knew at that moment was that the stranger sitting quietly in the corner, observing the scene with sharp, thoughtful eyes, was already planning to step in. Elon Musk leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the edge of his table. The gears were turning in his mind, and the lesson Jim had just imparted would soon resonate far beyond the walls of this small diner. Andrew leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. "That's a nice story," he said with a faint chuckle. "But don't you think it's a bit outdated? I mean, times change. You're not in the military anymore. You don't have to wear that like a badge of honor everywhere you go." The dismissiveness in his tone cut through the room like a blade. A few diners looked down at their plates, visibly uncomfortable, but still no one intervened. "Look," Andrew continued, "I get it. You're proud of your service. That's fine, but maybe it's time to let go of all that. Move on. Live in the now." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. For the first time, a flicker of hurt crossed Jim's face, though he quickly masked it. At a table near the back of the diner, a man who had been quietly eating his breakfast raised his head. He had a shock of tousled brown hair and a slightly unshaven look, dressed in jeans and a simple hoodie. Most people hadn't paid him any attention, assuming he was just another customer. But he wasn't just another customer. He was Elon Musk. Elon had been listening to the exchange with growing interest. He set down his coffee cup and glanced around the room, noting the discomfort on the faces of the other patrons and the quiet resilience in Jim's demeanor. Slowly, he stood up and made his way toward the two men. "Excuse me," Elon said, his voice calm but firm, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation." Andrew turned, his initial surprise quickly replaced by curiosity. He didn't yet realize who he was speaking to. "Yeah, and what's your take on it?" Elon's eyes flicked to Jim, a small smile of respect playing at the corners of his mouth. "My take? I think you're missing the point entirely." The diner grew still as Elon's calm voice filled the space. Despite his casual attire, there was something about his presence that commanded attention. Andrew blinked, clearly unprepared for the turn of events. "You see," Elon began, addressing Andrew but glancing around the room to include everyone. "What Jim is wearing isn't just about him. It's about us. Every single one of us here and everyone out there living their lives because of sacrifices like his." Andrew, his confidence faltering, attempted a nervous chuckle. "Well, I wasn't trying to offend." Elon held up a hand, not aggressively but decisively. "Let me explain it this way. Everything we achieve, every innovation, every leap forward is built on the foundation of what came before. People like Jim ensured we had the freedom to dream, to create, to succeed. Without that, none of us would be sitting here enjoying this coffee or debating what's fashionable. The weight of his words hung in the air. Jim shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable with being the center of attention, but there was a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Let me ask you this, Elon continued, now looking directly at Andrew. What's your proudest accomplishment? Your work, your family, your success, whatever it is. What if someone told you it didn't matter anymore because it's in the past? Would you be okay with that? Andrew opened his mouth but said nothing, his earlier arrogance replaced by visible discomfort. The diner patrons, now fully invested, nodded in quiet agreement. Elon stepped back slightly, giving Andrew space to absorb his words. Look, he said, his tone softening. I get it. In a fast-moving world, it's easy to lose sight of what came before. But the truth is, we can't build a meaningful future without acknowledging the sacrifices of the past. He turned to Jim, his voice filled with respect. I want to thank you, not just for your service, but for reminding us what it means to carry history forward with dignity. That jacket tells a story we all need to hear. The room erupted into spontaneous applause. Diners who had been silent before now felt emboldened. A young woman at a nearby table leaned over and said, Thank you for your service, sir. Another man, a retiree, added, You're a true hero. Jim, overwhelmed, simply nodded, his eyes glistening. Thank you, he said quietly. I didn't do it for the recognition. I just did my duty. Elon smiled. And that's precisely why it matters so much. Andrew, now visibly flustered, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I didn't mean to be disrespectful, he mumbled. I just didn't think. And that's the point, Elon interjected gently. Thinking, reflecting, appreciating, those are the things that make us better. The atmosphere in the diner transformed. What had started as a tense confrontation was now a moment of shared warmth and unity. The diners, energized by Elon's words, rallied around Jim in a show of collective gratitude. Put his meal on my tab, said a man at the counter. Mine too, chimed in another voice from the back. The waitress, who had been quietly watching everything unfold, stepped forward with a broad smile. Your breakfast is on the house today, Jim, and your coffee's always free here. Jim tried to protest, but the diners wouldn't hear of it. One by one, people approached his table, shaking his hand or simply offering words of thanks. A teenager who had been scrolling on her phone earlier asked if she could take a picture with him. My grandpa served in the Navy, she explained. Even Elon joined in, leaning down to shake Jim's hand. You've inspired me, he said, and I don't say that lightly. For the first time that morning, Jim allowed himself a small, proud smile. Thank you, son. That means a lot. Meanwhile, Andrew sat frozen, his earlier bravado entirely gone. He watched as the entire diner rallied around the man he had so casually belittled. He looked down at his untouched coffee, the weight of the moment sinking in. Finally, he stood up and approached Jim, his steps hesitant. Clearing his throat, he said, I owe you an apology. I was out of line. I didn't think about what I was saying, and I'm sorry. Jim looked at him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. Apology accepted, he said simply. We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. Andrew nodded, grateful but still clearly shaken. Thank you, he said softly. He looked around the room, taking in the approving glances of the other patrons. With a final nod to Jim, he gathered his things and left the diner, his arrogance replaced by a humbled sense of self-awareness. Before leaving the diner, Elon pulled the waitress aside and whispered something to her. She nodded enthusiastically, and he handed her a small card with instructions. Then, slipping out quietly, he returned to his unassuming car and drove away. 2 days later, Jim received an unexpected package at his home. Inside was a brand new military-style jacket, custom-made with replicas of his old patches, perfectly preserved. Attached was a handwritten note. Dear Jim, thank you for reminding us all of the true meaning of service and sacrifice. While your old jacket tells a powerful story, I hope this one can carry your legacy forward for years to come. Your resilience and humility inspire more than you know. With deepest respect, Elon Musk. Jim held the jacket for a long moment, his hands trembling. He wasn't a man who sought attention, but the gesture touched him deeply. Maybe the world isn't such a bad place after all, he murmured to himself, a tear slipping down his cheek. The story didn't end in that small diner. Unbeknownst to Jim or Elon, one of the patrons discreetly recorded the interaction and uploaded the video to social media. The post, captioned with, "A reminder of why respect and kindness matter," #thank you Jim, began to spread rapidly. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times, and by the next morning, it had gone viral. The video captured the raw emotions of the moment: Jim's quiet dignity, Elon's heartfelt defense, and the overwhelming support from the diners. News outlets quickly picked up the story, featuring it across platforms with headlines like, "Vietnam veteran teaches a timeless lesson on humility," and "Elon Musk's simple gesture sparks nationwide movement of gratitude." The hashtag, "Oh, thank you, Jim," became a rallying cry for people to share their own stories of veterans and their sacrifices. It created a wave of appreciation, with families posting pictures of their loved ones who had served and sharing personal anecdotes of their bravery. People began reaching out to Jim directly, writing letters and sending messages to express their gratitude. Veterans from across the country shared how they often felt unseen and forgotten. But Jim's story reminded them that their sacrifices still mattered. The moment had turned into something much larger than one man's story. It became a reminder of the enduring value of respect, kindness, and connection. Veterans organizations also saw an opportunity to channel the momentum into actionable support. Charities reported a spike in donations, and new fundraisers were launched to provide mental health resources, housing support, and job opportunities for retired service members. The video had started a conversation that extended beyond words, transforming into tangible acts of kindness. Back in the diner, life changed forever. What was once a quiet local spot became a landmark. People from all over the country traveled to meet Jim, sit in the booth where he always ate, and pay their respects. The diner staff embraced the attention, creating a special menu item called Jim's Breakfast, which consisted of scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee, his usual order. Proceeds from the dish were donated to local veterans groups, ensuring that Jim's story continued to make a positive impact. Visitors brought letters, gifts, and stories of their own. Jim was overwhelmed by the attention, but greeted each person with his characteristic humility. He often said, "I didn't do anything special. I just told the truth about my life. The real heroes are the ones who didn't make it back." Despite his modesty, it was clear that he had become an icon of quiet strength and resilience. The story also had a profound effect on Andrew. After leaving the diner that day, he spent time reflecting on his actions. He wrote Jim a heartfelt apology letter, acknowledging his arrogance and thanking him for his service. He also made a personal donation to a veterans charity and began volunteering his time to support local veteran initiatives. Though he had started as the antagonist of the story, his transformation became an important reminder that even those who make mistakes can grow and change. The ripple effect of that day extended far beyond the people who were present in the diner. Across the country, inspired individuals began performing acts of kindness in honor of Jim and other veterans. Strangers paid for veterans' meals. Children wrote thank you notes to service members, and communities organized events to show their appreciation. The story continued to resonate, touching lives in ways Jim could never have imagined. Jim's old jacket, the one that had sparked the entire exchange, became a symbol of everything the moment represented. He wore it with pride, knowing that it now carried not just the memories of his past, but also the hopes of a future filled with compassion and understanding. Elon Musk's thoughtful gift, a new jacket with replicas of his original patches, remained carefully folded in his closet. Jim treasured it, but always said, "This old jacket is the one I'll wear. It reminds me of where I've been and what we fought for." The video's reach continued to grow, and soon it was translated into multiple languages, spreading the story worldwide. Jim's experience became a universal symbol of the value of kindness and the importance of honoring those who came before us. While Jim was reluctant to embrace the spotlight, he eventually agreed to speak at several events, where he shared his story with others. Each time he ended with the same message. What matters most is how we treat each other. A little respect can go a long way. Elon Musk, meanwhile, reflected on the experience in his own way. In an interview, he remarked, "The world doesn't just move forward on innovation alone. It moves forward on the strength of people like Jim, who remind us why we build, why we dream, and why we care." That day at the diner was as much a lesson for me as it was for anyone else. Jim's story reminded people everywhere of the profound impact small moments of kindness can have. What started as an ordinary morning in a small-town diner became a global movement, proving that a simple act of standing up for what's right could change the conversation and the world for the better.